Hi everyone, thank you so much for coming to my presentation. My name is Chloe and my presentation is From Morphemes to Manuscripts, How Linguistics Can Make You a Better Writer. And if you aren't familiar with what a morpheme is, don't worry, we will get to that later in the presentation. Alright, so what will we be talking about today? First, I'll start out by introducing myself and also linguistics. What is it and why should you care about it? And then I'd like to go into three of the subsets of linguistics. So I'll be talking about semantics, syntax, and morphology, and I'll define each of those as we go. And lastly, I have some resources if you want to learn more, and Chloe from the future will be doing a live Q&A with you, so looking forward to that. All right, so as I said, my name is Chloe. I'm a full-time technical writer, and I've been doing this career for a few years now. I'm currently working at Red Hat, but in my free time, I'm also a part-time student in linguistics at Boston University. In addition to that, I have some other certifications that are language related. So I have one certificate in localization and internationalization, and I also have a graduate certificate in linguistics, again from BU. And moving on to more fun things, if anyone here is a fan of The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, I was in season 4, so you can look out for me there. And I just have to mention, because I find a lot of tech writers I meet, we all are tech writers, we like to crochet, and we love cats. So I call it the stereotypical trifecta, which I fit into. All right, so what even is linguistics? So I grabbed this definition from Oxford, but really a lot of places have pretty similar definitions, and there's consensus on the definition, which is the scientific study of language and its structure. So as linguists, we use the scientific method, and we're interested particularly in looking at the differences and the similarities between languages. So of course, languages are very diverse, and there's many different qualities to each of them. But at the same time, you might have heard of something called universal grammar. So linguists are interested in what kind of is connecting us all through language, and this innate ability of everyone to produce language. And so I think what a lot of people don't know is there's a lot of different sub-branches or subtypes of linguistics. So you can see I have an image here on the right, all these concentric rings making up linguistics. So I think this makes more sense if you think of language we can start at its very foundation of what the actual sounds coming out of our mouth is, or signs we're making with our hands as well. So, at the most basic level, we can talk about the different articulators in our mouth, like our tongue, and where its placement is, and how we're mechanically making sounds. And then we can build all the way up to like sentence structure, meaning, and discourse context. So there's really a wealth of diversity in the field. So I, of course, think linguistics is really cool and fun, but why should you all care about it? Well, my goal with this presentation, at least, is by teaching you some things about linguistics, I hope we can all learn to better communicate efficiently and unambiguously and accessibly. I think this is especially relevant for if you get your content translated or localized. And that could be a whole different presentation on its own, so I'll just try to, fill in those snippets as I go. But yeah, probably a lot of you use style guides at work. And I think learning about the linguistics, language, grammar, all the understanding behind those rules can really help us develop critical thinking skills, so that we're not just following the style guide just because, but we're really understanding why the rules are in place. And I think these critical thinking skills are really essential because as writers, not every situation you come across is going to have an exact answer in your style guide. So understanding all this background information, I think, can help us deal with novel situations, which we all need to do as documentarians. All right, so with that said, we'll get right into things. So the first topic I want to talk about is semantics. So semantics is defined as the branch of linguistics and logic concerned with meaning. So if you're someone who is interested in logic, or if you've studied something like philosophy, some of these concepts actually might be a little familiar because there's some overlap. All right, so you might be wondering, why are we going into artwork if you just said we're talking about semantics? Well, I think these two art types are great ways to define two different concepts in semantics. And I won't spoil the names yet, so let's first start analyzing these pieces. So on the left, we have a painting from the Impressionist period. And I'm, of course, not an art historian, but I take Impressionism as sort of very unclear. Like, we can tell this is a body of water with lily pads and flowers, but if you look at the grass, it's kind of just green strokes of paint, and the lily pads do have an outline, but there's not like a ton of detail. The flowers are pretty amorphous, so not everything has like very definitive shape. Again, it's very amorphous and fuzzy. Whereas if we look at the image on the right, and I'm guessing most of you have seen this image, but if you haven't, just take a quick second to yourself and think, what do you see in this picture on the right? And spoiler, this picture is called Rubens' vase, because if you look at the black, the positive space, you'll see a vase. But if you look at the white, you'll see two faces looking at each other. So in contrast to the left, Rubens' vase on the right has multiple distinct pictures going on. We have multiple distinct interpretations. So these artworks are really great to help understand vague versus ambiguous. I think these terms get conflated a lot, but they are different. So vague refers to non-precise, fuzzy meanings, whereas ambiguous, there are clear interpretations. They're just distinct. So multiple, at least two distinct interpretations. And I also don't say this to be a stickler, like you always have to use the right term. It's more so if we're aware that there are these different concepts, we can check for both of them when we're writing. So how can we use these concepts? Also, just a note, in this presentation, I try to use examples from real life, or even if they're examples I made up, things that are very close to things I see day to day as a writer. And I'll kind of go through each of these, explain the linguistic concepts that might concern the pieces of writing, and give a suggested edit for what I might suggest. All right, so an example of vague writing is something like the data uploads quickly. And we'll start out with an easy example like this. Probably a lot of you know it's better to give a specific amount of time versus just say quickly. And why is this? Because quickly can vary from person to person. So if I'm working on an application and I know it can take hours to process your data, I might think 24 hours is pretty reasonable, and that's pretty fast. But if a user is using your application for the first time and they're kind of expecting things, fast, they might think quickly means like 10 seconds. So of course we want to bridge that gap and make sure we're on the same page. So a solution would be, of course, give a specific unit of time. So after you click submit, the data uploads within 24 hours is one option. And the after you click submit is kind of like the trigger point, letting the person know that's the point where we start the clock, and then you can expect the data within 24 hours. And I have a picture here of Yao Ming, who, if you aren't familiar with, he was a very tall basketball player. And I have this picture with him next to a child because it's a great way to understand another term called indeterminacy. So there's a famous example of indeterminacy that is, Johnny is tall for a basketball player versus June is tall for a kindergartner. So basically the lesson here is when we're using words like adjectives, their meaning really depends on our comparison class. So, I can say the girl in this picture is tall, but of course when we see her next to Yao Ming, that sentence kind of becomes false, right? Whereas if she was next to children her age, who she happens to be the tallest out of, it might be a true phrase that she is tall. So that's just kind of food for thought of watch out for when you're using things like adjectives. Okay, next we'll get into ambiguity. So remember the image of the vases, or the faces looking at each other. So lexical, if you've heard of lexicon, that means like a dictionary. So lexical ambiguity refers to ambiguity from individual words, like the meaning of a word. So I saw this example in real life. So of course I was very excited because I was like, that's lexical ambiguity. I need to save this. So it was a definition for a glossary term, and I don't have the glossary term name here because it's not relevant and just for privacy. But you can imagine there was a glossary term, and then this sentence is the definition. Accounts for the part of nodes that are not allocated to run workloads. So when I first read this, again, aside from being excited, it was an example of lexical ambiguity. My first interpretation was that accounts, the first word of that definition, was referring to a noun. So as in like user profiles. So the glossary term was a user profile for nodes. And then as soon as I kind of processed that, I realized that's not what the writer actually intended. The writer intended accounts to be the verb accounts, as in this glossary term takes into consideration the part of nodes. So you can see accounts can be both a noun, a plural noun, or a verb, as in takes into consideration. So this is why I was confused. There was two distinct possibilities. So how might we fix this? Well, put simply, in my example, I wanted to use a word that can only be a verb. So calculates cannot be a noun. The noun version of calculates is calculations. So we could consider something like the glossary term calculates the part of nodes that are not allocated to run workloads. That would cover the second option here on this slide. And maybe you don't love the word calculates, maybe I could have picked a better one, but my point here is we wanted to disambiguate between noun and verb. So there's different ways you could do that. All right, and the last example here is syntactic or structural ambiguity. So we'll talk about what syntax is later, that's where we get syntactic, but as you can see from the alternative name, structural ambiguity, it's ambiguity that's based on the structure of the sentence or the way the sentence is arranged. So I always kind of caution writers to look out if you're using the word with. So with is a preposition. In the sentence we have, do not use a default security group with a wider IP address range. So with plus everything after it, a wider IP address range, is called the prepositional phrase. Now, that's not too important yet. Let's get into more of an analysis. So this sentence has, in my opinion, two readings. The first, and don't worry too much about all these technical terms, I kind of just put them here in case you are curious, but if it's confusing you more, just disregard. But the first option is what we call noun phrase attachment or NP attachment. So essentially, another way to describe this is something you should not use is an X with a Y. So something you should not use is a default security group with a wider IP address range. So in other words, the word with a wider IP address range is how we are further explaining what the default security group is. So in other words, a default security group that has a wider IP address range, sort of like belonging to the security group. That's option one. Option two is verb phrase or VP attachment. So a way to look at this is a bad way to use an X is with a Y. So a bad way to use a default security group is with a wider IP address range. So this is what's called an instrumental reading of with. So Y, or the wider IP address range, is sort of like a tool we're using to do the default security group. So hopefully that makes sense, how you can see there's, even if the technical terms are a little confusing, hopefully you can see there's two different meanings. Either with is clarifying what the qualities of the X are, or it's saying we're using X with the Y tool. So how could we solve this or disambiguate? So my suggested rewrite is do not use a default security group and a wider IP address range at the same time. So at the same time disambiguates, and it shows that we're talking about you don't want to use these two distinct things at the same time. And better yet, it's always good to frame documentation in the affirmative if you can. So you might notice this phrase is telling a user what not to do. So I don't have the full context of this sentence, but perhaps the writer could also just tell the user what to do instead. So that's sort of semantics. One last note, probably should have said this earlier, but I also want to clarify, natural language is inherently vague and ambiguous. There's always going to be vagueness and ambiguity. So my intention isn't to say like we need to eradicate these things from language. That's not possible. That's not how language works. But I think as writers, it's definitely reasonable to try to avoid these things and make sure everyone is on the same page between the writer and the readers. All right, so that brings us to a next topic, syntax. And syntax is the arrangement of words and phrases to create well-formed sentences in a language. So sort of keyword I think of when I hear syntax is sentential structure, sentence structure. All right, so one aspect of sentence structure that I think is pretty commonly talked about with technical writers is passive voice. So, of course, style guides tell us not to use passive voice, and I totally agree. Most of the time, you should be using active voice. So I want to preface this presentation with that. However, there are some cool features and maybe even benefits of passive voice that I think sometimes we don't talk about. So here I have this fun little dragon here. So consider these two sentences. My friend was abducted by a giant green dragon versus a giant green dragon abducted my friend. Now, you can obviously disagree if you're a native English speaker, but sort of the literature tells us the first sentence is a little more impactful because we're putting the exciting thing, the big green dragon, at the end of the sentence. So I said, my friend was abducted by a giant green dragon. So in English, what we put at the end of the sentence tends to get emphasized. And how did I move giant green dragon to the end of the sentence? Well, that's because I used passive voice. So maybe not as relevant for technical writing, but if any of you are novelists or, fiction writers, this could be something you might want to look into because it can really nicely change the emphasis of your sentence. And instead of focusing on, sort of the mundane everyday part, we're focusing on the novel giant green dragon. All right, so now I want to get into how does this even work with passive voice? As I said, we moved the exciting part to the end of the sentence. Well, this is called a sentence tree or syntax tree. And don't worry too much about most of this. I know it might look a little overwhelming, but mostly just wanted to show you in case, any of you are interested in linguistics, this is the kind of stuff you might be getting into. So again, don't worry about understanding every part of this tree, but, and I took this tree from Xingjia Rachel Shen, so thank you to her. So this sentence is, his friend carried him to the hospital. So this is a sentence in active voice. And I just want to show you this cool thing that happens when we pacify English sentences. So, again, this tree is saying the subject is his friend. If you remember back from school when you probably learned about grammar, you learned about subject and predicate. So his friend is the subject. And then within the predicate, we have what's called the object. So that would be him. So his friend carried him. And you can also omit to the hospital. That's kind of something else we don't need to worry about. So his friend carried him. Now, when we passivize a sentence, what's cool is the subject actually becomes the object in the passive voice, and the object becomes the subject. So instead we have he was carried by his friend. So he here was him in the object, now it's the subject, and his friend, the subject in the active voice sentence, is now the object with a by phrase. So he was carried by his friend. So as you can see, passive voice is a way we can get something from the beginning of the sentence in English to the end. So that's kind of just something fun to consider. All right, so as I mentioned, there are some benefits to passive voice. Again, most of the time in technical writing, we should be writing in active voice, but here's a few considerations. So I already mentioned emphasis. Again, maybe in technical writing, we don't need to kind of draw into drama and emphasis, but, imagine you're writing an update in an email to the company. Consider the sentence, we've been absorbed by a large multinational and successful corporation, compared to a large multinational and successful corporation absorbed us. Now, as I mentioned before, you absolutely can disagree about which one sounds more emphatic, but in English, it is shown that the first one would be more emphatic because we're putting the large multinational and successful corporation at the end. So maybe that will get people a little more excited than the second sentence. Another use of passive voice, and I should back up, one of the reasons we don't want to use passive voice is because it obfuscates who is doing the action. And in technical writing, we of course want to be specific and clear about most things we're writing about. However, sometimes we actually can benefit from obfuscating the subject, because sometimes by calling out the subject, it sounds like we're blaming whoever that subject is. So imagine you're in an application and it's scanning for errors, and you get a message, you've probably seen things before like, 4 errors were found. Well, that might be because the application doesn't want to offend you as the user. Imagine if you saw one like, you made 4 errors. A little more aggressive, perhaps. And the last consideration is, I wrote it kind of just simplified as, it sounds just less awkward sometimes, but really why that is because sometimes we care more about the actual thing we're talking about. So what do I mean? For example, the file is saved. Let's say you're in Microsoft Word, you're typing in a document, and it says, the file is saved. That sounds better than Microsoft Word saved the file, because if we're writing in a document, we don't really care who saved the file, we just care about our file, right? We don't want to lose all our work. So of course the user just wants to know about the file. They don't need to know that Microsoft Word saved it. So perhaps that's why we wouldn't expect to see something like the second example. All right, and the last topic I'm going to get into is morphology. So morphology is defined as the study of the internal structure of words. So I think about units of meaningfulness. And that brings us back to the title of my presentation, From Morphemes to Manuscripts. So I will, as I promised, define what a morpheme is. So a morpheme is the smallest distinctive unit of a language having a definite grammatical function. So I have an image here. I think morpheme is most easily explained by showing some examples. So the image here, we have the word cat. Now, there's nothing k about a cat, there's nothing a about a cat, and there's nothing t about a cat, right? Cat is just the series of sounds that we make in English to describe the furry little animal on the screen here with pointy ears, right? So cat is just one morpheme. We can't break it down anymore. It's not like k or a or t has further meaning. Just cat is the sounds we make to refer to that animal I mentioned. However, if we have a word like cats, plural, now we have morpheme 1, cat, and s. Now s is meaningful. It tells us something. It tells us there's at least 2 cats. There's more than 1 cat. So that's what a morpheme is. So the word cat has 2 morphemes, cat and s. It's breaking down a word into the meaningful units. So another really good example is the word unhappiness. So unhappiness has 3 morphemes. 1, un in English, we use to mean like the opposite or inverse of something, or the negation. Happy is the second morpheme, and it means, the state of joy, or however you want to describe it, that feeling we feel as humans. And then the third morpheme is ness, N-E-S-S. That's how we make something a noun in English. So put all those morphemes together, and we get the meaning of unhappiness, the state of not being joyful, or however you want to phrase that happy morpheme. So that's what morphemes are. And what I want to talk about in morphology is this idea of syncretism. So syncretism kind of has a more complicated definition, but I tried to simplify it here to just make it really easy. So syncretism, essentially for our purposes, is when 2 different categories or words look the same or are expressed the same way. So let's start with a more everyday example. We have a sentence like, she painted the wall green. And you'll see painted is the past tense of the verb paint. However, if we take a sentence like, the painted wall is where she'll hang her photograph, painted looks exactly the same as it did in the first sentence. It's spelled the same. It should be pronounced roughly the same. Yet painted here is an adjective. So you can see just because something looks the same in English doesn't mean it's the same type of word. It just happens to look the same. So how could this apply more to technical writing? Well, you might see things like the application transferred the data versus the transferred data is in the queue. So again, first example is a verb, second example is an adjective. So this is especially relevant for translation because a lot of people don't think about this, but just because transferred looks the same in English, even though they're different parts of speech, that doesn't mean they are the same word in other languages. So especially with machine translation these days, sometimes a human isn't necessarily looking at the translation. Sometimes they are, and again, that's a whole nother presentation, but if we can help the translation process in any way to clarify which type of transferred we mean. Do we mean the past tense verb or the adjective? So how could we do that? Well, when we have an adjective, an ed adjective as we call it, we can consider adding the word that. So that is what's called a complementizer. So for example, the data that you transferred or the data that is transferred is in the queue. Now I have a question mark next to the first example because a lot of times when we add that, sort of protest I hear a lot is, this makes the sentence sound weird and too long and awkward, and I thought when we're writing we're supposed to use less words. And that can be true for sure. And this is kind of an example where you have to use your best judgment. So maybe you read the first sentence, the data that is transferred is in the queue, and you're like, that's just like too much of a mouthful. I don't like that. By all means, you don't have to do it. But I think, sometimes adding that is also nice because it clarifies who's doing the action. So we kind of talked about that in passive voice. Like the data that you transferred makes it clear. It's not obfuscating who is doing the transferring. So anyway, this is a good example of I don't always have all the answers. It depends on the situation you're in, and hopefully these tools can kind of help you make your best judgment. So aside from ed verbs and adjectives, something similar we see in English is with ing verbs and gerunds. Now, probably one of the biggest misconceptions I see with technical writing is people often think anything that ends in ing is a gerund, and that is not true. So an example of an ing verb is I am cooking. So I am doing the act of cooking. So this is a verb, or specifically present participle. Whereas a gerund is a noun. So I love cooking. This has turned cooking, the verb, into a noun version. And they just happen to look the same, but they are not the same part of speech. So again, what's an example in something we might see in our careers or day-to-day? So the application is transferring the data, and it should take 2 minutes. So that would be a verb, versus the transferring of the data should take 2 minutes. So we turn transferred into a noun. So this is kind of a very similar thing to ed verbs versus adjectives. We want to disambiguate. So I would suggest kind of just, whenever possible, just doing present tense, plain present tense, is my recommendation. So instead of even worrying about transferring, just say transfer. So the application takes 2 minutes to transfer the data. So hopefully you can see, just because two things look the same doesn't mean they actually are. All right, so now I'll wrap things up with a little summary. What can linguistics teach us, and what have we talked about in this presentation? So remember from semantics, we talked about vague and ambiguous. Vague was like the Impressionist painting, fuzzy, sort of unclear things, and ambiguous is when you have multiple distinct meanings. And again, we cannot eradicate vagueness or ambiguity from natural language. My point here is just to make sure you're keeping an eye out, looking for these potential issues, and trying to mitigate vagueness and ambiguity whenever you can in writing. From syntax, we learned, yes, most of the time we should use active voice, so please don't just start using passive voice all over the place. But we did talk about some of the goals passive voice can help us achieve, like emphasis, or clarifying who's doing an action. And lastly, in morphology, we talked about how I always recommend using the word that, which is called a complementizer. That can help you clarify if a word is an ed verb or an ed adjective, or if it's an ing verb or a gerund. So again, ing verb is a verb, gerund is a noun. And again, this is especially helpful for translation because just because two words in English look the same in English doesn't mean they will in a different language. And to wrap things up, I just like this quote from Dali, which is, "Begin by drawing and painting like the old masters. After that, do as you see fit. You will always be respected." I like that because it's kind of this idea of, yes, we have style guides, and yes, we need to understand them before we can break the rules. So once we understand our style guides and what's actually going on with our language and writing, we can kind of use it to our advantage and maybe think outside the box. So I'm not saying, totally disregard your style guide. The second part of this quote says you will always be respected. I can't guarantee that, but I hope that gives some inspiration for how we can use language to our advantage when we really understand how it works fundamentally. All right, so that's my presentation. I wanted to close with some resources. So I know a lot of writers are interested in linguistics, so I highly recommend a free resource called the Virtual Linguistics Campus. If you're just starting out, you can take a general sort of intro to linguistics, I think they call the course, but there's also lots of other courses for specific sub-branches of linguistics if you want to learn about anything specific. I also have some resources here for if you're interested in pursuing a degree, and just general writing resource. I really love plainlanguage.gov, so I always recommend that when I give presentations. Here are my references. Definitely go through these if you want to learn more. And thank you so much. I'd like to thank all my professors, especially from BU, and then my lovely editors who helped me edit the proposal and this presentation. So thank you all so much, and I look forward to seeing you in the live Q&A.
Well, hi, Chloe. I'm so glad to have you here to do a Q&A with Write the Docs. And we have a ton of questions and lots of interest in your talk, lots of engagement in chat, because people just love this kind of linguistic, I want to say nerdiness, but we just love it. We love words. It's who we are.
For sure, yeah.
The first question, which has gotten the most upvotes, and it's really a pretty good question, how has your background in linguistics helped you navigate cultural differences or considerations within technical documentation?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, so I've studied languages for a while, and I also used to kind of be in the ESL space, so teaching English to speakers of other languages. So I'm always thinking about kind of communication and how to be more accessible in terms of what your native language is. So yeah, I guess specifically in interacting with colleagues or writing documentation, I definitely encourage checking the language section of your style guide. And of course, the basic things people always talk about, I don't know, different norms for directness or different types of norms for communication. So yeah, I think just being aware of these language differences definitely helps when you're thinking about how to communicate with different people.
No, I agree. Yeah, I do think communication styles also differ a lot from culture to culture. So that goes in there too. Can you talk a little bit about how revising text linguistically has affected the accessibility of the documentation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is actually something I'm kind of interested in because I don't know how much research there is surrounding some of the changes I talked about make an impactful difference. However, it is considered best practice in the industry and in terms of accessibility. So if you look at all the major style guides, they'll mention some of the things I talked about. So sorry, I already forgot the question. Can you say the second part of that again?
How has revising text linguistically affected accessibility in your documentation?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so I think it's kind of best practice in the industry, and the idea is if someone isn't a native English speaker, or also if you're getting your documentation translated, these steps can really help. And when we're thinking about translation these days as well, a lot of times a machine might be the first pass, or depending on your budget, it could be the only pass. So doing some of these things can really help make sure you get a better result the first time. And even if you do have a machine translation and then a human does look at it, that costs money if you have to make changes. So it's also a really great way not only to be accessible, but to, spend your budget on things that are more impactful.
Absolutely. So here's another question. When you create a style guide for many contributors, how do you explain that sometimes rules, such as passive voice, can be broken in the right circumstances? Do you give examples, or do you only list rules and take care of it in editing or in the context of peer reviews?
Yeah, interesting question. I actually kind of have written a style guide. I think a lot of tech writers wouldn't be responsible for that, but a previous job I was at a startup. So my belief is there's no point reinventing the wheel. So what I did was I took the Google developer documentation style guide and I said, use this. And then if there was anything we needed to deviate from as the company, that's what I wrote. So I haven't really had to deal too much with that. I think what's always hard is like, yes, you need to follow a style guide, but also you sometimes break the rules. And like, I can't tell you, and the style guide can't tell you exactly what to do in every situation. So I think the most important thing would be, yes, of course, like give some examples if you think it's relevant, but also encouraging people to use like critical thinking and understanding that like, yeah, I can't give you all the answers. Sometimes you have to do what you think is best.
Absolutely. Well, okay, well, here's another one. Have you worked with multilingual SMEs? And if so, what role did they play in refining your tech talks, if any?
Yeah. So not just SMEs, but yeah, I've worked with a lot of multilingual SMEs, also customers. Um, at a previous job, I used to work at Amazon, and actually the documentation I wrote was almost exclusively for non-native English speakers. There were a couple English speakers, but yeah, so all of my content had to be translated. So I was just kind of completely always aware of, exactly how I was communicating, how my sentences would be translated. And even if they weren't translated, the idea that a non-native speaker might be reading it. So I think kind of all this language accessibility really got ingrained in my mind, and that's why I'm kind of maybe tend to be a stickler about it, but I'm also just constantly thinking about it. I don't know if that answered the question, but
No, I think that's fine. Well, this one is kind of a very lighthearted one. What role did you play in The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel?
oh yes. So I was actually just an extra, nothing too fancy, but I was very lucky because I somehow ended up right behind all of the main characters. So my scene was like in a theater, and just very lucky I got sat directly behind the star of the show.
Oh, that's really great. That's really awesome. Okay, I think we have time for at least one more
Great.
question. Do you time box yourself when debating between different sentence structures? I'm only asking because I can just see myself second guessing everything from now on.
Yeah, that's a really fun question. So I tend not to be like super strict about things when I write. So like, no, I don't give myself like, you can only have 10 seconds to rewrite the sentence, but I do think that is something worth considering. Like at some point you have to be okay with okay, or like good enough. Not just with language. I think that's like everything in your career. So yeah, like obviously you don't want to be agonizing over a sentence. And a lot of times also when you read a sentence so much, it like you kind of need to take a step back and come back to it later because it's just in your head too much. And yeah, also something I find a lot is I'll like write something and then 6 months later I'll come back and be like, wow, did I write that? Like that needs to be fixed. So just being okay with like you have to do the best you can, and yeah, we're not aiming for perfection, just like do the best you can.
Yeah, that's really about all we can do. I think it's interesting, the whole time boxing thing, because I think it would probably just be going on in the back of my head no matter what I was doing.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, here's one more that just popped in. I didn't see this. Do you have any advice on how to encourage others in your organization who are involved in writing, but not directly responsible for it, to get better at writing? It's a good question.
Yeah. So I guess something I've done is at previous jobs, like give talks. So, and I found like a lot of people, even if they're not professional writers, they really want to get better at writing, or they feel like
Mhm.
there's a lot of improvement they could make. So, if your organization has opportunities to kind of knowledge share, I think it's great to kind of do a crash course in writing, or I don't know, go through a style guide, or something like I just did. So, and even if you like don't have that opportunity, I think just sharing style guides, or if you notice like specific issues, kind of being like, hey, just wanted to show you like this part of the style guide. This might help you. So, yeah, just kind of sharing your knowledge as much as you can.
Okay. That sounds really great. I'm looking forward maybe to seeing a talk from you on morphology and morphemes and linguistics at one of our department meetings.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you so much. That was a really interesting talk. I really had trouble. I had to sort of come over here to Q&A, and I was like, oh, I don't want to because this is such a fun talk. So I'm going to have to listen to the end of it again. So interesting, so fun. Thank you very much, Chloe. And we really appreciate the time and the energy that you put into this.